Do you know what makes someone silently irresistible without saying a word? It's not looks, it's not money, and it's not trying to be liked. It's something deeper, something most people never notice, but always feel. Today, you will understand 7 habits that make people naturally magnetic in silence. And by the end, you'll realize attraction is not what you say, it's what you become. But the last habit is the one that changes how people remember you forever. Let's begin. 1. Master your presence. Most people walk into a room, but they are not really there. Their mind is somewhere else. Thinking about judgment, thinking about mistakes, thinking about how they look. But silently attractive people are different. They are fully present. They don't rush. They don't fidget. They don't chase attention. They simply exist with control. When they enter a space, people feel it immediately. Not because of noise, but because of stillness. Stoicism teaches a simple idea here. You cannot control attention, but you can control presence. When you slow down your movements, when you stand with calm posture, when your eyes are steady, people start paying attention without knowing why. Example, 2 people enter a room. One is rushed, looking around, trying to be noticed. The other walks slowly, relaxed, aware. Guess who gets remembered? Not the loud one, the calm one. Because calm feels rare, and rare things feel valuable. 2. Develop emotional calm. Now let's go deeper. Most people lose control over small things. A rude comment, a delay, a misunderstanding. And suddenly their emotions take over. But silently attractive people do something different. They pause before reacting, not because they don't feel emotion, but because they don't obey it immediately. This is emotional control. Stoics believed something simple. Events don't disturb you. Your reaction does. Think about this. Same situation. 2 responses. One person gets angry instantly. Another person stays still, observes, then responds calmly. Who feels more powerful? The calm one, because emotional stability creates trust. People feel safe around those who don't break easily. And here is the truth most people miss. Calmness is not weakness. It is control under pressure. And control is always attractive. When you stop spreading yourself thin, your presence becomes stronger, and people start valuing your attention more. Because they realize you don't give it to everyone. 3. Cultivate active listening. Now here is something almost nobody practices correctly. Listening. Most people don't listen. They wait. They wait for their turn to speak. But silently attractive people do something rare. They actually listen. They don't interrupt. They don't rush replies. They don't think about themselves while others speak. They focus fully on the person in front of them. And this changes everything. People remember how you made them feel, not what you said. When someone feels heard, they feel respected. And respect builds attraction faster than words ever will. Stoicism teaches control of attention, and attention is your most powerful tool. Where your attention goes, your energy follows. So when your full attention is on someone, they feel it, and they connect with you deeply. 4. Practice subtle confidence. Now let's clear something up. Confidence is not loud. Confidence is not proving yourself. Confidence is not talking more. Real confidence is quiet. It's the feeling that you don't need approval to exist. Silently attractive people don't explain everything. They don't over-defend themselves. They don't seek constant validation. They simply act and let results speak. Example, a confident person makes a decision. A doubtful person asks 10 people first. Who feels stronger? Not the one asking, the one deciding. Stoicism says, focus on your actions, not opinions, because opinions change, but your actions define you. And when you stop seeking approval, people start respecting you naturally. If you are finding value in this, subscribe now. This channel is for people who want to understand psychology, discipline, and human behavior in a simple way. Let's continue. 5. Value quality over quantity in relationships. Most people chase attention, They want more friends, more connections, more approval. But silently attractive people don't chase quantity. They choose quality. They don't talk to everyone the same way. They invest deeply in the right people and ignore the noise. This makes them different. Because in a world of overconnection, selectiveness becomes powerful. Stoicism teaches this clearly. Not everything deserves your energy. Not every person deserves your time. 6. Cultivate a calm and purposeful voice. Now listen carefully. Your voice is not just sound. It is energy. Most people speak fast because they are nervous, or they fill silence because they are uncomfortable. But silently attractive people do the opposite. They speak slowly. They speak clearly. They speak with control. They don't rush their words. They don't try to impress. They simply express. When you slow your speech, something changes. People listen more carefully. Your words gain weight. Even simple sentences feel powerful. Example, compare this. I don't know, maybe we can try it, I guess. With this, we can try it. Let's see how it goes. Same idea, different power. One sounds uncertain, the other sounds grounded. And grounded always wins attention. 7. Maintain an air of mystery. Now here is the final habit, and this one is often misunderstood. Mystery does not mean hiding. It means not revealing everything at once. Most people over-explain their life. They talk too much. They reveal too quickly. They remove curiosity. But silently attractive people don't do that. They leave space. They let others wonder. Stoicism teaches restraint. Not everything needs to be said. Not everything needs to be shown. When people don't fully understand you, they pay more attention. Because the mind is naturally drawn to what it cannot fully decode. Example, a person who shares everything immediately becomes predictable. But a person who reveals slowly becomes interesting. And interesting always wins attention. Final takeaway. Silence is not emptiness. Silence is control. And control is what creates silent attraction. Let's bring it together. Presence makes you noticeable. Calmness makes you trusted. Listening makes you respected. Confidence makes you stable. Selectiveness makes you valuable. Voice makes you powerful. Mystery makes you unforgettable. None of this requires noise. It requires awareness and discipline. Stoicism is not about saying more. It is about needing less. Less reaction, less validation, less noise, and more control. Because in the end, people don't remember the loudest person. They remember the one who felt different without trying. Real power is never loud. It is quiet, stable, and always in control.